the pandemic. Right, we have hopefully online Ross and Harry and Paul and Claudia for the item 11. Just check if we have whoever is leading us through the next one. I could see Ross in the harbour there. Right, so we've got the Natural Hazards Risk Management Action Plan. We have a presentation on this, and who will have the controls? Will Ross or?
Ross.
Okay, cool. So Ross, you should have the ability to share and the controls there. We'll just go through the presentation and then have questions at the end if that's easier.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. I don't actually have permissions to share at the moment, so while that's loading up, I'll do the introduction. So, kia ora, Karos Roberts, Toku Ingoa. Presenting with me today is Claudia Harford, who's our Principal Geotechnical and Natural Hazards Specialist and does, to be honest, most of the hard work on NHR map. And Claudia and I are based in the Resilient Land and Coast Department. There we go. It looks like I've got permission now. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. With us today, we've also got in the background Paul Kleinack, the General Manager of Resilient Land and Coast. And this is our regular 6-monthly update on the Natural Hazard Risk Management Action Plan. So we first presented NHR Map to this committee in June last year, and the purpose of the Natural Hazards Risk Management Action Plan is to coordinate activities within Auckland Council. So it's an internally facing document that outlines Auckland's natural hazard risk, and it describes the activities that we're undertaking to mitigate that risk. NHR Map is one component of Auckland Council's natural hazard risk management approach, and it sits alongside other strategic documents that are equally important. So the intent of NHR Map is not to duplicate the work that's described in those documents, but to fill the gaps in between them. And it sits alongside the Civil Defence Group Plan, which is why there are no actions in here focused on civil defence emergencies. It's presented in 3 sections, and the key parts are part 1, which gives an overview of the 10 natural hazards of most significant to Auckland, and part 2, which outlines the function areas across Auckland Council that play a role in natural hazard risk management and describes the tasks that they'll be undertaking to manage that risk. And there's also a set of appendices that give more details on the statutory framework. So these are the 10 natural hazards described in part 1. Shown here, ordered from left to right by how frequently they occur. And part 1 was developed to inform decision making, provide a shared understanding of the risks that affect us and the impacts they might have on Auckland. And it's intended this risk assessment will be updated approximately every 5 years. So we're a few years off our next update for this part of the document yet. Part 2 is much more detailed, and part 2 describes all the tasks and actions that are being undertaken across Council. And it's really important to emphasise at this point that NHR Map is a communication and collaboration tool. And as such, it doesn't own or direct any of the projects listed in part 2. Each of those projects will have its own governance structure, its own reporting requirements, in addition to this high-level reporting, and they're not necessarily delivered out of our team. So this is an across-council thing, and the work we're describing here is happening in various parts of Council. These are 2 particular highlights I wanted to bring up since our last report to you, which was in December. The publication of our liquefaction hazard layer, which has been developed in accordance with Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment guidelines. Auckland Council really led the way on this, started our mapping earlier than any other council, and has been followed by councils around the country now. So we have region-wide hazard mapping for this, which is really helping to inform development in Auckland, making sure it's being done in the most resilient way possible. And the Whangaparo Shoreline Adaptation Plan, which has been to this committee. I'm sure you know all the details of this quite well. The first of 20, which we published covering the full Auckland region, and sets the direction for development of assets on public land all around the coast. So since the endorsement of the plan in June 2021, there's been good progress made on many of the plan's tasks. At the moment, we've got 55, which is 71% of them, showing as green. They're on track. 12 of them, about 15%, are amber, and that's primarily because of delays related to staff availability and COVID-19. We describe things as being amber when they're delayed by potentially 3 months, in that sort of order of magnitude. What we've presented here is a series of coloured red, amber, green charts, just showing against each of the actions and tasks how our progress is, and you can see that there's a lot of green on the chart. All the detail is in the report, and because there's 31 of these. I won't go through them all today. It would take far too long, but they're all presented there. You can see that there's good progress being made across all the different areas. Some of the highlights that I want to point out, the Risk and Assurance Department is commencing work on updating the risk appetite statement, including the incorporation of natural hazard risk into the framework. That's because the current risk appetite framework states that Auckland Council has no appetite for risk to life, and that's a physical impossibility. Whenever we get out of bed, there's always some risk, even if it's very small. And that made it impossible to align natural hazard decisions to our risk management framework. So Risk and Assurance are working hard to resolve that issue. The Natural Hazard Risk Management Action Team are working with the Maori Outcomes Advisors in our department to develop a strategy for mana-whenua engagement regarding the best way to effectively embed Te Ao Māori into the Natural Hazards Risk Management Action Plan. And that's an ongoing piece of work that will continue for the life of the project. And Claudia will tell us a bit more about that towards the end of this presentation. We're also looking at, completely separately, a project to consider how natural hazard areas are involved as a qualifying matter in the assessment when development is proposed. This is our feedback into the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and it looks like that has been well received. So we're increasingly confident that the National Policy Statement for Urban Development won't be causing extra problems in natural hazard zones because of the way it's being developed. And the final one I want to highlight is phase 2 of the cumulative loss modelling project, which is looking at the level of asset damage and loss that could be experienced by Auckland Council at the moment due to earthquake shaking and floods, which are the priorities for our insurance purposes. Future phases will look at other hazards as well. And these are really important bits of information we need to understand exactly what our exposure is so that we can manage it in the best way possible. So those are my key highlights. There's a few more in the report, but those are the ones that really stand out as most important for this committee. We have, as part of this update, been doing a fair bit of consultation, and we've consulted with natural hazard experts from academia, infrastructure providers, all the lifeline utilities, and Crown Research Institutes to help us make sure that we're focusing on the right areas, making sure our natural hazards research is appropriate and focused on where the need is for the future. And this shows the responses that we've received. So a bigger blue bar is the high priority areas, where the areas of Shinstad to the right, and a bigger orange is areas that the experts consider are low priority. And this is good news for us. It really supports our current research priorities, which are focused on coastal hazards, land instability, flooding, and volcanic hazards, are right. We're looking at the right areas. There's quite a lot of work happening as well on tsunami, but that's more through the Civil Defence Group, because it really is their priority area, something that they're managing already. So there's a lot of work happening there. So it looks like our research is happening in the appropriate areas, and we'll keep refreshing this and making sure that we're using our time and funds appropriately. The final bit I want to talk to you about is our self-assessment scorecard. This is Appendix C of the report, and this is a summarised version of it. We use this to help us identify where we need to do more work, and we use it to inform the gap analysis that we do whenever we update NHR map. So we've defined 12 key performance indicators to help us focus on those key areas, and we will continue to improve these alongside the plan. So we take feedback on these KPIs, make sure that they're the most appropriate. And each time we provide an update, we refresh this self-assessment using input across the council. And for this update, we've incorporated input from technical experts outside council as well to make sure that we've got a validation on the work we're doing. So this really presents how well we think we're doing for each hazard, as well as presenting how our work on the hazard should be prioritised. You can see in here that, for example, flooding is ranked third in our priority list because it's the one that has the relatively high combination of risk and consequence. But there's lots of scores in the 4s and 5s there to suggest that there's a lot of work happening in the area. We have a reasonable handle on it, although that we know it's an area that we need to continue working on, and will always be a problem for us in Auckland. Whereas if we look at the other end of the spectrum, tornado, it's an area where we have relatively little work, but it's a lower priority for us because it's not one that we have much ability to control. And so because we have very little ability to control it, the benefits of researching it and doing more work on it are limited. However, I think it's fair to say that this has highlighted to us that more work is needed on that particular area. And now I'm going to pass to Claudia to talk about our focus for the next 6 monthly period.
Good, thank you, Ross. Just going through the first point, a key focus for the next 6 months for our team is to work with mana whenua to embed Te Ao Māori principles into the action plan. 2 senior Māori outcomes advisors joined the team earlier this year to provide strategic guidance and to help us liaise with the Independent Māori Statutory Board Secretariat. Our Māori Outcomes advisors are very experienced in developing climate resilience-focused partnerships with mana whenua, and we're pretty confident that their involvement will accelerate the delivery of this task. In May of this year, we began early consultation with the IMSB Secretariat. They subsequently directed us to continue engagement at an operational level with the INES Forum. And there are plans to present NHR map to the INES Forum after August this year. In terms of gaps analysis, in the coming months, we'll be focusing on identifying gaps in the action plan. As Ross mentioned a few minutes ago, we have consulted with natural hazard experts externally and within council to help us determine our focus in the immediate future. So the focus for the coming months is to work towards incorporating that feedback into the relevant parts of the action plan. We'll also be consulting more widely within council to capture any tasks or action linkages and overlaps that may not already be reflected in the plan. And this could result in additional actions being reported in the next period. And lastly, our last focus, well, one of our key focuses, is to refine project scopes. There are currently about 20 actions in the plan that are either in scoping phase or yet to begin in the next financial year. The focus will be in the coming months will be on refining these scopes so that the action leads are in a strong position to deliver the projects, and the NHR MAP team is in a position to support them where necessary. Yes, and we're now open for questions if anybody has any.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Ross and Claudia and teams. Do I have any questions? Not yet. Member Wilson first, from the IMSB.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just looking at the tasks, which include task 4, for instance, and task 30, where they're the tasks are specifically looking at mana whenua aid. I guess my first question is, what, if any, resource will be made available, because they seem to configure themselves into this action plan? So that's my first partai.
I'll make a start on that. So through the chair, our first priority for this was to engage external support to act as a liaison. So we have engaged Martin Tamani, who will be supporting the mana whenua groups we're working with to make sure that their availability is suitably resourced and they don't have to do so much of the work themselves. By acting as an intermediary, he's going to be able to take the bulk of the workload and facilitate both sides of the conversation to make sure that the work is efficient and that time is well spent. And I'll pass to Claudia to build on that.
In task 30 relates to the cultural and Māori heritage. Is that correct? Does my memory serve me right?
Aye.
Yes. So that's really driven by the planning team, and I believe that they've made good progress in terms of setting up processes to deliver their task.
Thank you. So I'm hearing one in terms of advisory, that is a mana whenua member, but their task, do you mean, is to go across the wide range of mana whenua? I'm not understanding how they can potentially garner a response on behalf of 19.
Yeah, Kira, through the chair. It's important we separate out the various different roles happening here. So when I was talking about the role of Martin Timoni, his role is working with the NHR Map team to help us embed Te Aomari into NHR Map. But NHR Map is a collation tool. It's a collaboration tool that summarizes many other projects. And a lot of those other projects will have their own governance structure and their own engagement policy and their own engagement approach. Each of those is not reliant on the NHR Map resources that we're talking here. They have their own resources, and Task 30 is one of those examples. Unfortunately, because we don't have a representative of that project here with us, with so many projects, we couldn't bring them all in. We can't talk too much about the details because we don't know everything that they are working on, but they are, I understand, working and engaging with Mana Whenua, but we haven't got the details here of how that is occurring.
Okay, I suppose I'll just say then, I know it's a comment as opposed to a question, but just to round that off, it's pleasing to hear that you're working with the Secretariat. There are, in terms of partnerships, they need to be examined, even though this is an action plan, at a high level. So I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair, in the sense that I think it would be advisable to continue with the Secretariat and get them to support you in terms of what's required to be achieved here. Thank you.
Kia ora, Member Wilson, completely agree. I guess building on Member Wilson's question, how does this, you've mentioned it a little bit, but how does it interrelate with the Shoreline Adaptation Plans? Because I know that that's, built in very closely with Mana Whenua, Mātā Waka in those spaces. How does this action plan kind of feed in both ways for the Shoreline Adaptation Plans when you're doing each part of the coast, I guess?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the Shoreline Adaptation Plans are one project that will report into this action plan or report to you through this action plan, as well as the other reporting lines. The intent of the National Hazardous Management Action Plan is to summarise the activities that are happening across councils so that the whole of council knows what's going on and we don't end up with duplication of effort or gaps between effort because people assume that someone else is doing it. So the Shoreline Adaptation Plans are the doing. This is the summarising of what's happening across council. And so you'll see in this report, it summarises what's going on with the Shoreline Adaptation Plans. And that allows other parts of council to understand what's happening. But this action plan does not direct the Shoreline Adaptation Plans in what to do. It's a summary and a collaboration tool.
Thank you. And which data do you use on the coastal hazards, the inundation and the erosion, when you've had several different maps come out, and you had the NZ sea level rise come out a couple months ago that didn't necessarily match with the National Adaptation Plan, and when we're trying to talk about one set of data to use to inform the hazards, how are you doing that?
That's a fantastic question, yes. Ensuring that we have quality, valid, up-to-date natural hazard data is one of the core roles of the plan, and make sure that we have a shared understanding, and that's what part one is all about. And we keep the natural hazard data sets up to date. Whenever things change, we improve them, we resolve them, we find issues with them. It's worth noting, specifically with relation to the NZ Sea Rise project, that the hazard has not changed as a result of the NZ Sea Rise project, and the data that we're using in the Shoreline Adaptation Plans is within the range presented by the NZ Sea Rise project. So it wasn't a surprise to us. It presented more detail than has been presented previously, but we are already dealing with the same order of magnitude of sea level rise that was presented in the NZ Sea Rise project's data. So that hasn't been, the data we're using hasn't been superseded by that. And there are some issues with the NZ Sea Rise project which suggests that we shouldn't jump in and be using that immediately. There's more work to done to verify it. So we have what we believe is the best data available, and we have a work program to continue to develop new data sets as things change. A good example is coastal inundation, where we continue to evolve the data sets we have. We're getting better quality data all the time, and there's another improvement due in about 2 months. So our data is improving as the science improves, and we're using the best available.
Thank you. And my last question, just you mentioned the MPSUD, and I had been a bit of a broken record on this around the density predictions around the coast. So you believe that what we are presenting and what we will be presenting to the commissioners in our plan change is sufficient to protect our coast with the coastal inundation and the coastal erosion, the dropping down that density essentially?
So I'm not a planner, but my understanding is that what has been presented is the best that is achievable within the framework of the MPSUD. But there are other things going on at the same time, which will further reinforce our resilience against particularly coastal hazards. So, for example, there is a plan change being prepared to implement the changes to the hazard zones. Currently, hazard zones are shown in the unitary plan for coastal erosion, particularly in the cliff areas, in a way which is not compatible with the best available science. And so last year we published a report giving new hazard lines. And this year, the Plans and Places team are doing a fantastic piece of work to implement that into the unitary plan, so that instead of using the old definitions, we'll be using the current, much more valuable definitions, which are different and will give us a much more robust basis for pushing back against developments in inappropriate places.
Right, so that low density zoning is, you think that's sufficient data for that low density zoning around our coasts and cliffs?
In conjunction with the other work that's going on, yes.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much. There are no more questions. So thank you very much for your work and all the work your teams are doing in quite a broad...
Are you there? I had a question. I indicated it in the chat.
So,
That's okay?
Sorry, Councillor Walker, I don't have access to the chat. We just missed that. Apologies. Councillor Walker, questions?
Sure. So, look, a couple of quick questions. First off, as far as risk is concerned, given that risk is a function of probability times magnitude, do you have the information on that? So actually breaking things down, because the magnitude is probably relatively stable, doesn't change too much unless you have more development in an area. So it's the probability that changes. And the reason I'm asking that question is if we've got access to that, then that enables us to obviously reevaluate the risk on that basis. So do you have that data set?
Through the chair, Kira, yes, we do. And it's constantly evolving. So NHR Map Part 1 presents the preliminary understanding of the probability and the magnitude of all those 10 various different natural hazards. And it presents them over a range of different timescales. One of the challenges we have when comparing natural hazards is that there's different qualities of data, different qualities of science available for each one. So a direct comparison can be quite challenging, but an attempt has been made at that.
Okay.
I mentioned earlier about
sure.
the cumulative loss modelling project, and that will be a step change in our understanding for this because, as you rightly say, risk is a function of probability and magnitude. It's also a function of the assets that you have, your exposure to that.
Sure. So what was the project you mentioned?
Cumulative loss modelling.
Say again?
It's called the Cumulative Loss Modelling Project, and it's being run by the Risk and Assurance team. And that is a project which takes the best available probabilistic hazard information and models it overlaying on assets. And that can be used to look at physical assets owned by council. It can be used to look at residential property. It can be used to look at environmental
okay,
assets.
excellent. If that's available, if you could send me a link to it, that'd be great. The other question I've got, which goes to hazards, is around the impact of storm surge and flooding events that are associated. That's particularly current right now in Sydney, and the reason I'm asking that is they're quite distinct from sea level rise. The underlying causality is the same, but sea level rise has got an inherent lag. Storm surges and the like, given that they relate to in storm events, lower barometric pressure and so on, are far more immediate. So are you looking at the risks of storm surge and flooding events as distinct from sea level rise?
Through the chair, yes, we are. There is a lot of research happening in New Zealand to look at how climate change will affect storm events in New Zealand. And NIWA is the lead agency on that one, and they're working through that. We use the best available data we can from NIWA. There's a whole range of impacts that climate change will have, and as you're rightly pointing out, sea level rise is a lagging indicator, but increased storminess is much more current, and that leads to flooding. It also leads to increased susceptibility to landslides, along with many other hazards. Heat waves were mentioned earlier in this meeting, and that's another similar problem. So yes, we do recognise that as an important issue, and yes, we are working with other agencies to ensure we're using the most current data to incorporate into our hazard management. It's fair to say that it is evolving science, and so we don't always have the quality information we would like, but there are lots of agencies working on improving that around the country.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your questions, Councillor Walker. And now, thank you again to the teams for all this work. Right. Could I have a mover? Councillor Walker, did you want to move this?
Sure, happy to move, and I appreciate the effort here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seconder? Councillor Young? Thank you. Would anyone like to speak to this? Well, thank you very much. Once again, I'd just like to acknowledge the teams, the work, significant right across council, and I'm seeing this roll out with the Shoreline Adaptation Plans, the huge amount of data we have to Te Tariki e Tawhiri, and all the work we're doing with our coastal assets and other hazards across Tamaki Makaurau. The planning that has got to go into this is huge, and I just acknowledge the work of the teams trying to address things as we have a changing climate, as we've seen right across Auckland the last few months, but also as we're seeing in Sydney right now, and thoughts to them and the discussions over there around potentially insurance not even covering the types of damage that's happening over there. So there are big questions, but this data and this work going forward will help us inform our residents on these hazards and help where we can to protect them. Right, all those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone against?
Aye.
No? Perfect. And we now move on to item 12, the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity and the update on our